Zen Benefiel has been an experiencer since he was a young boy. Today, as a well-respected author, businessman, and life coach, he continues his amazing work helping others, and he's joining us today. Hi, Zen, how are you?
I'm great, Dean, and such a pleasure to be with you.
Great to have you here. As we mentioned off air, I thought this could go off into a lot of different little rabbit holes, but we're going to try and keep it
and
focused.
I am a tangentialist. I'll have to admit that. So
yeah.
I do seem to be able to bring it back to the circle, though.
Right. Okay. So I just thought maybe let's just talk about initially about you as an experiencer, because that's what I find fascinating. So it started pretty young for you.
It did. Being an experiencer, there's it's like calling the contact modalities. There's many varieties of how that actually happens, and it has to do with worlds other than our own or our own normal daily experience. When I was young, I didn't know of this event until my parents brought my adopted sister home. I was 4 years and 5 months, I think. And of course, she arrived with no fanfare. There was no pregnancy, no anything, and kind of made me wonder. And my parents decided, oh, maybe we better talk to him about being adopted. So they shared that. Now, I knew I was loved, cared for, nurtured, beyond imagination. And so there was no question there. However, because now I knew that I was not their biological son, it got me to questioning who's my biological parents. And I've been attending Sunday school, so I even had the questions of, do I have a father and mother in heaven? And how can I talk to them? And I don't know how many months later, I was in we had a 2-story house, and I was on the landing of the stairway looking out over the front porch in a small window, and I had my elbows in the windowsill and my head on my hands. And it was after dark. I was waiting for Dad to come home from the school or from the store. And all of a sudden I hear this big booming voice say, "Hey, you." And so you can imagine the depth it was such a deep voice. It resounded. I wasn't afraid. I was startled, right? Because all of a sudden I hear this voice. It's like, whoa. And I spun around. I said, Mom, you hear that voice? She goes, what voice? Because she was sitting about 20 feet away watching TV, and the voice definitely didn't come from the TV. And because it was inside my head. And I said, that's that voice. It said, "Hey, you." She goes, "No, I didn't hear any voice. Must have been a peeping Tom." So I realized at that point I was living in a different world, and didn't I didn't take it any particular way. Just I trusted my experience, and I knew I heard it. And so over the next few months, I would stand in front of windows at night with the lights on inside, and I would project that same "hey, you" out telepathically. Now, I had no idea what, this was just a little kid experiment, right? So I would project this voice out, and I would stand there and I would wait. And as I was able to be more quiet, the voice eventually answered. And so we set up this communication link, and I started asking questions, and it would respond. And always, a guide, a mentor, a father figure, all the kinds of things that trustworthy. It felt that way, right? So unquestionable. When I've not listened to it, I've suffered, right? So I learned, maybe I, pay attention, because we tend to, especially as adult, we second guess everything, right? Most of us play the imposter syndrome. We're not worthy. We're not enough. We don't have enough. What if people saw us, who we really are, all that kind of stuff. And I deal with that in my coaching business. So having established this voice, then a couple years later, Dad had a house built. He was a tool and die maker for General Motors and a 32nd degree Mason as well. But he had a house built. We moved in, and I was out playing with the kids in the neighborhood on Saturday. And that afternoon I came back. I was just really tired, laid down on my bed, and I felt myself start to rise up, and it got kind of freaky. I didn't know what to expect. And the voice simply, it says, just breathe, relax, and let go. It'll be fine. And so I did, and then I pop out of my body, and I'm, basically on the ceiling. I turn around and look at my body laying across the bed, and I figure out that I can move around the house that way. And over the next few months, maybe even a year, I would get into that. I think it's called the hypnagogic state, right in between sleep and waking consciousness. And I was much freer in that place. And so I'd be able to pop out of body, and I could feel the sensation, build to where I knew that was going to be available. I just had to be quiet enough and not think about it, because whenever you would think, or I would think about it, I would pull back into my body, right? So I was learning all this stuff as a kid, right? Didn't realize how important it would be later in life. And then at 8, I wake up in the middle of the night, and I'm in the corner of my bedroom looking at my physical body, and I watch myself take the covers off. I stand up and I open the window up next to my bed. I climb out, and so I watch myself. I move through the window or the wall, watching myself. I walk across the neighbor's backyard, and we lived in a rural community. Walked across the neighbor's backyard, and there was a 10-acre pasture that had a fence around it. I climbed the fence, and I walked out into the pasture. And as I would get into the pasture, I started rising up into the air. And I looked up when my observer self looked up, and there was this orange cigar-shaped cloud that had to have been a mile long.
Wow.
And I kind of followed my body as I rose into the air. And then when I would reach the perimeter of the cloud, I would go into it. My observer self evidently became one with the participant, and I'd wake up in bed the next morning. Couldn't wait to go back. There was some kind of inner excitement it was like being with a family that I hadn't met yet.
Right.
And so those experiences happened for about 2 years, probably twice a month is my guesstimate.
Well,
for sure.
Just I guess people are wondering the voice. Who was the voice, and the cloud? Was the cloud some type of craft that was disguised?
Well, okay. So first answer, the voice of being. I never gave it a label, asked who it was. I just didn't need to, right? It proved trustworthy. So why take it any further than that? It just wasn't necessary. It's like ancillary details that aren't important. To many, categories, labels, titles, and things like that are important. That's how we're built as humans.
Yeah.
But the inner world doesn't need it. It's all frequency, right? You either trust it or you don't. And you can tell just simply by the resonation and of how you feel internally with it. So answer to the second question, I was 23. I had moved or was getting ready to move. The auto industry was huge in the Midwest, and in 78, it took a dive. By 81, it had trickled down to our local community. I was working as a machinist, a meat cutter, and playing in a band. I played drums, and all 3 jobs fell through in 3 days. It was just horrible, right? And so I walked out on the front porch, and I threw my hands up to the sun, and I said, okay, I'm listening. Where do you want me to go? And I literally heard Phoenix.
Wow.
And so 3 weeks later, we packed up and moved. In between that time, I went over to a metaphysical bookstore in Muncie. I lived in a small town called Alexandria. We're about 15 miles away. And I went into this bookstore, and I was walking around. There was maybe a couple, 3 other people in there, and it's a decent sized bookstore. There was nobody in this particular aisle, though. And as I walk past, a book falls off the shelf and opens on the floor with the cover up. And I look around like, oh shit, here we go. Right. And so I walk over and I pick the book up, and the front cover says Strangers Among Us by Ruth Montgomery. And I turned it over, and the first paragraph that my eyes are drawn to, paraphrase, says, the most common contactee experience in the Midwest in the late 50s and early 60s was the orange cigar-shaped cloud.
Wow.
So you can imagine, now this was 12, 13 years later, right? How that affected me. I mean, it was like a domino effect where a lot of things that had been happening, dreams and visions and things like that that I'd had, all of a sudden fell into order. I still didn't understand the order, but the order was there, right? There was confirmation as to what it was that I had experienced and why I felt the way I did about it. It's like family, right? And so um, then we moved to Phoenix, and things continued here. One of the first people that I met here in Phoenix, and I'll back up in a sec because there's another thing in between. But one of the first people we met here in Phoenix was Travis Walton's sister-in-law. And at that point, she said, "You really need to meet Phoenix, Travis, and because your stories are really similar, and I just think you'd really enjoy it." Well, I didn't meet him till '97, but it did happen. That was 1981. Now, backing up a few years, when I was in college at Ball State, which is also in Muncie, Indiana, which is where the bookstore was at. That's how I first found it. I was in a pre-med program. I tested out 5 quarters going in. I was in my second quarter, and I was distraught about life going into the second quarter. And I hit my knees and I prayed to know what truth was. And not knowing, be careful what you ask for, right? Because I also committed that I was willing to die for it if necessary. And I was determined if that was necessary. Then, somewhere inside of me, I think I knew that there really was no death because I found that out in the following experience. And so the following Tuesday, this was the 1970s, and I'm not abashed about my behaviors back then. I came back from class and did the obligatory bong hit and album side meditation in between class and homework, right? And nothing that should have affected me in this way, but I'm listening to Journey's first album. Second song is called In the Morning Day. And in between the vocals and the vamp, this voice approaches me. Now, my given name's Bruce. And it says, "Bruce, are you willing to die for what you believe in?" And of course, I kind of butt puckered for a moment, thinking, "Oh my God, what do I believe in?" Well, my first thought was Christ consciousness. Felt a little empty, didn't question it, just moved on. Second thought was cosmic consciousness. And with that, it felt full. So I said yes and let go. And at the same instant, Neil Sean does a guitar riff that sounds like a rocket ship taking off right before they go into the vamp. And I get a slight tug at my solar plexus, and I pop out of body and turn to look at it across my bed. And I turn back to look where I'm going, and I'm immediately engulfed by white light. I don't even get turned around all the way. And it had this iridescent, effervescent, really high-pitched sensation that just felt like home.
Right.
And I realized I could still think. I was analyzing what was happening. So with that, I realized, oh, I still think I'm not dead then. But it got boring because all there was white light. I couldn't see a physical body, had no tactile sensations, nothing else going on. So my impetuous teenager came out and said, "Wow, is there more?" And then I feel another movement of energy, and I'm surrounded by points of light with an indigo background. And as I began to ask the question of what the points of light were, I immediately got the understanding they were points of consciousness, whether in body or not. I wasn't sure because I knew I wasn't, but I had the sense that they probably were somewhere. And at that point, the voice picks back up and it says, "These are those that you are to work with in order to facilitate a new world order. It will happen in your lifetime. Know this to be true. Your path will be full of trials and tribulations." Understatement. "Have faith and trust that everything you need will be there at its appointed time. Trust and allow." And then I felt another rush of energy, and I'm back in my body taking a gulp of air. Now, I got a few things out of that immediately. First was, oh shit, what just happened, right? And the second was, oh, we are all cosmic consciousness condensed into form. We just don't realize it. That point of light's in the center of our being. I don't know how it all works, but I understood that from a very basic level at that point. I was 18. Now, the questions I came out of that with were, how do I prepare? What do I need to do in order to be prepared? How do I recognize others? And how do I give myself to that and still be functional in the world? And got kind of crazy for a while. I told my parents about it. They had me see a psychiatrist. And on the third visit,
Wow.
I had it was a godsend, actually, because, after sharing with him, he wasn't condemnatory, just had great inquiry and enough awareness of his own journey that after the third visit, he said, you're not crazy. You've had a spiritual awakening. Why so young? I don't know. Most people don't go through it till the mid-40s, if they ever do. But I got something that might help. And I'm like, okay, cool. What's that? Well, he had his office in a historic home in downtown Anderson, Indiana. And it was 2-story. So he took me upstairs. At the top of the stairs, he opens the door, and my heart just explodes as I'm looking into the room. And there's all kinds of metaphysical posters and stuff, and even some stuff hanging from the ceiling, bookshelves, and a card table with a deck of tarot cards sitting just inside the front of the door. And I look at those, and I look at him like, I'm really confused now, right? Because here's a psychiatrist that's on, right? It's just not expected, especially in the Midwest. So he says, you know what those are? I said, yeah, they're tarot cards. And he said, you know what they're used for? I said, yeah, you ask them questions, you do a spread, and it's fine. Or you get answers. And so from that, then he did a spread, and some of the things that I knew about were, and I knew he didn't, they came out. And afterwards he says, my best advice is keep your mouth shut. Nobody's going to understand the wisdom that you carry at your age. This is not going to happen. And so I'm kind of a blabbermouth. That didn't work. But I kept it quiet a little bit. But it made a huge difference, at least having that corroboration and that understanding. Yeah, somebody understood what I was going through beyond being diagnosed.
Right.
Right?
The light experience, so it wasn't an NDE?
Well, it had all the classic signs of it, but there was no trauma involved. Most NDEs happen because of some kind of physical trauma that puts the body in some kind of state where the consciousness can't be in it for a moment.
Right.
Mine was volitional.
Yep.
So it's a bit different. I haven't found a way to really describe it other than it was kind of a profound NDE.
Okay. We've spoken about the voice. Have there been any like physical contact experiences with other beings, or
yeah,
they have?
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, do you mind talking about those?
No. I'd probably say the most significant was in 1991. I kind of, to frame my life at that time, I was producing and hosting a TV show on public access at the time called One World. And I was involved with the metaphysical community. I'd been helping to put on events, living by myself and in a guest house. And one night I'm awakened on a steel gurney and I'm laughing as I wake up. And I normally sleep nude. When I woke up on this gurney, I had a t-shirt on, but that was it. But there were, for lack of a better, electrodes lining my sphincter that had wires attached to them, and they were hooked up to a machine. And there were 3 tall grays that were kind of pushed up against the wall next to it.
Right.
And I learned later that because I was laughing, I was in the present, my energy was huge, and they're so sensitive that energy just kind of, they didn't expect it, because most people wake up like that and they're scared.
Yeah.
Right. And so they want to fight or flight or whatever. And I was laughing, and I'm like, come on, guys, what are you doing? You know, and I started pulling them out, and I got to the last one, and I felt a sting, slight, but I felt a sting. And I opened my eyes up, and I'm back in bed. And I was like, oh, shit. I just had the perfect opportunity to have a conversation I've been wanting to have for decades, and I blew it. And so I closed my eyes and I tried to go back, not knowing how. And in that liminal space, I run into a male figure that was wearing a shimmering, it was dark and light simultaneously, and it's shimmering. And he says to me, next time, just relax. We're just trying to tune you up so we can communicate more easily.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm sure the audience goes, what? Well, just so happened that the prior week I was studying the nervous system with my girlfriend, who was training to be a massage therapist. So she was going to be tested on the nervous system. And one of the things that we discovered was the perineum nerve, which is a direct, it ends in, it comes from the tip of the spine and ends in the genitals,
Mm-hmm.
both the genitals and the anus, right? So if you had the technology to adjust a vibratory system, even subtly, where would you plug in? Right? So it may seem invasive, but we have all these, you know, belief systems about our genitals and sex and all that kind of stuff that you know, it's just misguided in my estimation. So whenever there's any talk or discussion about those areas, people get really timid and afraid, and like, oh, we can't talk about that. So what, right? This is what happened. And over time, then, so that was in 91, don't remember the month, but on May 10th of 2010, I'm in a different relationship, been together for almost a decade at that point, and I'm laying in bed on my stomach, and my handlers show up, and I feel their energy, and I'm like, I'm excited. It's like, hey guys, haven't, you know, great to feel you, and you know, be here with you. You know, what's up? Why are you here? And you know, I got the deadpan. We're here to give you an upgrade. I'm like, okay, cool. You know, because I get much more emotional, excited, and these guys are just totally deadpan emotionally. So I said, okay, let's do it. And I feel it's like a point of contact on the back of my occipital lobe, and all of a sudden there's a really high pitched sensation that goes along with it, and it reverberates in my cranium. I have no idea what's going on, but it just feels amazing.
Mm-hmm.
And so they finish up. That took, I don't know, maybe a minute. It wasn't long. And then they finished up, and they said, okay, we're done. We're out of here. You know, and I was trying to have more conversation, and they weren't having it. It wasn't part of their agenda, right? So, and yet they were serving me, which I found to be quite interesting.
Right.
So then I got up, I woke my girlfriend up, told her about it. She was kind of amazed. I went in, wrote about it. Now, by this time, it's like 2:30 in the morning. And then I didn't say anything to anyone. The following February at the International UFO Congress in Fountain Hills, which is not too far from where we lived, I had talked to several members of the UFO discussion group that I had facilitated at the firehouse in Mesa on a monthly basis. I talked several of them into getting a vendor table there.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd walked off to listen to Richard Dolan speak, who I'd met several years before. And the first thing he told me was that, oh, you got to be tagged. And I'm like, no, not really. At any rate, I came back, and the woman's name was Inya Bodner. And she walks up to me. She's originally from Sweden, highly sensitive, talks to her guides, comfortable with them. But she says to me, I've been talking to my guides about you. And I, well, yeah, really? Because I get excited when people vet me, because some of the stuff that comes out of their mouth is just almost incredulous. And she says, yeah. And they, because I was, I want to know more about you. And he said, and she says, they didn't say anything to me, but they showed me this diamond shape with one smaller and one above and below it. And they said that, and it was in the back of my head. And they told her that I was plugged into the cosmic computer.
Mm.
And I just went, oh, interesting. And then what Dan Winter had said to me a decade before, well, yeah, a decade before I met him, he was coming through town doing workshops. That in our conversation, and I don't know how we got on the topic, maybe we were talking about ETs or Galactic Federation or something, but he says, Ashtar is the acronym for the cosmic computer. Now, again, it was like, yeah, okay, whatever. Because I hadn't, I keep all this stuff at a distance because I have to in order to be functional, right? I
Yeah,
can't get
yeah,
absorbed by it. And yet, sincere questioning still is there. Never asked him what the acronym actually meant, no, which was the one thing that I should have asked but didn't, because I was just kind of, interesting, right? So there's all these things that kind of go along with this contiguous life experience that I have.
right, right. Zen, the ability that you have, the out of body experience. I mean, why you? Why do you think you've got that ability? And you say you're adopted. Did you do any investigation to find out whether it's something that may have been a family trait?
Man, you love to throw quite multiple questions into one. Okay, so first one, why me? Why not? I've set up. There are certain things that, um, the other thing I know about that point of light is that we bounce back and forth between here and the great light multiple lifetimes until we understand that, yes, we are cosmic consciousness condensed into form, and we figure out what our perfected form, fit, and function is in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that could take a lifetime, as it has, right? And it can be really joyous and fun. And also, I'd like to call it excruciatingly fun, because there are those really tense or intense moments when you just got to really you got to be fearless,
Yeah.
right? Second part was, as I recall, was your question about, did I do research? Yes, I did. In my 30s, I wrote all the adoptee identity talk shows and things like that. I got a response back from Geraldo's production coordinators. He said, oh, here's a bunch of information you can check out. Well, I didn't have any names or socials or anything else, or birth times at that point. I eventually did. Then when I got married met my twin flame in 2016. She's from St. Petersburg, Russia. And what a better, because my life's been themed with harmony among people and planet, and what a better mate to have. So one of the things she did, our first Christmas together, she bought me a subscription on Ancestry. And then in January of 2019, my half sister shows up, and I get a notice from Ancestry. And
Wow.
I'm like, oh, cool. So we start chatting, and then I find out my birth mother is still alive, and I'm kind of the last thing on her bucket list. And so we get to know each other. I have phone chats and video chats. We go back and spend a week with her that summer at her house in Anderson and get to know her. My wife she was laughing all the time because there were so many similar character patterns
Mm-hmm.
that we had. So genetic, nature, nurture, some of these things are embedded, right? And it was funny, but some of them weren't so, I guess, appropriate for building relationships. So I adjusted them over time because I learned that they, could be better. And it really wasn't necessary for her. But I also found out, this was the really amazing thing. I found out my dad's name. And so I started doing research on him, and I had a friend that had skip tracing software, and he tracked him through Phoenix and up into Prescott. Well, there was a guy, his name was Leroy Carlisle. And there was a guy named Lee Carlisle that I had met at a UFO discussion group here in Phoenix in the late 80s that was from Anderson. And never thought of the possibility of him being my father.
Yeah.
It might have been a fleeting thing in the moment. I don't really recall, but it wasn't something that I dwelt on. But we got along famously. He invited me up to his cabin in Prescott. He had a house on the same property that was renting. Went to several discussion groups there with him. And then he said he was going to go to India because that's what he wanted to do. And we lost touch. And then once I found out all of this, I started researching, and we even went up, tried to find him, found out he'd passed in 2017. And I did find the guy that lived in the house at the time. And he said, "Oh yeah, that was Lee. And I remember you." So, I wanted to meet my birth parents. The universe supplied the opportunity early on, didn't even know it. But I got to meet him as a man, not as my father.
Right. So were your mother and father experiences? Had they had similar type
Dad
of?
was, but mom not so much.
Okay. Yeah, that's fascinating.
Isn't it? I mean, it's like the magical mystery tour of a lifetime, and it's not a movie. I live it.
I omitted to ask you what the upgrade was that you received from your handlers.
Again, it had to do with better communication, right? I have this fearless attitude towards seeking truth. And I have radical, Dennis Pataco, he's a publisher, runs a website called bizcatalyst360.com. And he hosts articles from authors all over the world. He's got like 26,000 authors. And he made a comment about me one day of how I have this radical curiosity and provide different perspectives of looking at life. And yet I do it from multiple perspectives. I got 2 master's degrees in business. I've got a transformational life coach certification, a secondary teaching certification. And I've been in a lot of different industries. And so I have multiple ways of looking at things, and yet seeing beyond them and looking at it from above rather than from below or inside, right? Because there's patterns, there's processes, there's cycles, rhythms, all kinds of things that are available when we're able to extricate ourselves from being engaged by them and just observe them. And then you can make better choices as to how to interact.
Yep. Okay. You contacted me on Facebook Messenger after you'd watched one of the interviews I did with Kevin Briggs. Was there something that resonated with what Kevin's story with your story?
Kevin and I just seem to have a resonation. I have to be honest, I don't recall actually, the details of listening to it. And I may have only listened to part of it. It was the fact that the 2 of you were talking. And Kevin and I had established a resonance in our communication early on through, I think it was the Free Experiencers group initially,
right?
Which I eventually got booted from because I called the administrator out on his own behavior. Happens.
Yeah, it does. It does. Zen, I was going through one of your books, Stubbing My Toe, and I highly recommend people have a read because you're not charging anything for it. It's a download on the site. And there was one chapter in there you've titled "What is Truth?" and you list 4 questions, which I found fascinating. So I want to look at each one of those individually. So you looked at
Sure.
the first question was, are we greater beings under limitations of modern science and spirituality?
Are we? You know, as we find out, I mean, look at what's happened over the last 50 years of our advancement in awareness of consciousness, and that we are not the body. We are not even necessarily the mind. You know, that there's a repository elsewhere. And for hundreds of years, maybe thousands, there's been this knowledge of these records, some call it Akashic, information, right? Data that's just stored somewhere that somehow we have access to. And that in the process of gaining access, we find out more about ourselves and our capabilities and our ability to learn new things and develop skill sets and all kinds of really interesting things. And when one pays attention to that, and I'll reference, yeah, easy for me to say. I'll reference Wilbert Smith's The New Science, in that the people from elsewhere had told him, we live half inside and half outside. Now, I was aware of that, but I didn't really think about it in those terms, right? And so when you think about the old adage of making the without as the within, we haven't even developed the within yet. We're just barely scratching the surface of that being that we are and how connected it is to everything around us, to the point of, like the law of attraction says, you know, whatever you think and feel strongly, you're going to produce, right? Well, that's vibratory, right? That's a mechanism of how consciousness works, and the interchange that takes place at a quantum level. So now what used to be called living in spirit is living in quantum entanglement with the unified field. And depending on how aware one becomes and acquiesces to, right? Because it's not something you can push or pull. It just doesn't work that way, energetically, right?
Yeah.
It's a flow. The more you become aware of the flow, the more flow you experience, right? It's like anything. The more you become aware of something, the deeper relationship you build with it. So in this building of relationship, then we begin to become aware of how we can co-create our world, our reality.
Right.
And it's a much more highly disciplined activity than most people are willing to take on, because it's just weird to begin with, right? Because we're so used to being told, okay, in order to get this, you got to do that. And this is the whole adage of the do, be, have scenario, right? Well, I flip that. You got to be first, and then the doing and having will find greater order that really makes your life what it is possible to be.
So you've already touched on it, but another question you asked was how about cosmic truth?
Yeah, how about that? So what is cosmic truth? Let's start there. What could it be? What, in your wildest imagination, what might cosmic truth be? Is there a codex that kind of contains all the information about how creation works? You know, how it's structured, how it works, who's in charge, all the different beings, all the levels of intelligence necessary to manage it all? Because it's obvious that we live in a conscious universe, right? When you begin to look at things through that lens, it's very apparent that we are. And all the guys, all the thought leaders in all the different consciousness areas and their own silos corroborate that. Now, how do we live that is one of the next questions. But before we answer that, if there is this repository, okay, so here's an example. One of the questions I had, because I see the Trinity ubiquitous in all the religious patterns, right? So where'd that come from? What's the source of that? Well, the opportunity I got was in 1989, going through a multi-level awareness technique, which was developed by William Swigard, And it takes a facilitator to kind of, it's a guided, almost kind of like hypnotherapy session, right? It's guided imagery, and then you can look at your Akashic records, work with your chakras, speak to your guides, just depending on what you intend to do at the onset of it as to where you go with it. Well, I didn't even get a chance to, I started getting prepared. I went through the breathing exercises and the centering, and then all of a sudden my guide shows up. My guide's named Zephyr. I'd met him in college after my white light experience because I was questioning, do I have one? I was reading Castanada's stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So, and in one of my meditations, this Indian's face and the name Zephyr appeared. And then a few days later, I was told to grab a pen and paper. I was listening to George Harrison's Living in the Material World album at the time.
Right.
I was told to grab a pen and paper and write. Well, I wrote 3 pages, what looked like Sanskrit. I had no clue what the hell I'd just written, right? Took it around to different professors around the campus, and they had no clue. And most of them just said, thought it was chicken tracks, bullshit. But I knew there was something more. So I had a friend who lived on the other side of the dorm who did automatic writing. And I said, hey, is it possible we could meet up and figure out who this guy is? And he says, yeah. So that weekend we did, and he tuned in, wrote the same type of script. I hadn't shown him anything, just because I wanted to keep it clean, right? No influence. So he writes the same shit. And I'm like, man, I don't understand this. You? He said, no. I said, well, is it possible that you could get your guide to interpret? And I said, I don't know. I've never tried it. Let's see.
Mm-hmm.
And so we did. We found out Zephyr was from what is now the southwestern United States over 20,000 years ago. He was a shaman for the civilization in that area. So be that as it may, and it was like, yeah, okay, well, I'm still having this interaction with him, so it doesn't really matter who he was or where he was, or it's another one of those trusting things, those trust relationships in the inner worlds. So he shows up as I'm getting ready for this experience and just waves to me and says, come. So I'm out of body and we're traveling across the universe, and I see stars going by for a little bit, and I turn to look at him, and he looks like this little ball of light with a huge nose on it, like Jimmy Durante. And I kind of poke fun at him because he's good at poking fun at me and my iniquities, right? And my silliness sometimes. And so as we're traveling, he says, yeah, just, don't worry about where we're going. And so we had a recap. So of the last half dozen years, because I hadn't seen him in that long. Then eventually we arrive at this 3-sun system with about a dozen smaller, maybe a 20th of the size of the white spheres. And the spheres were kind of not just luminous, they were kind of white, golden tinge, and almost rainbow sparkly. And the planets, or what appeared to be planets, were all the same size, and they were really vibrant green. And we're at the perimeter of this scene, and I feel like Ellie in Contact, right? And like tears rolling down her eyes because she's just in such awe of what she's seeing. That's how I felt. And the next thing I know, I hear there's like multiple voices. I couldn't identify with exactly how many, but multiple voices speaking as one. And it said, we are not only your forefathers, we are also the forefathers of your solar system. And I start to ask questions, and Zephyr stops me. He says, nope, that's it. You got all you need. You'll figure it out. And I'm like, I'm sorry. I wanted to have some superlatives back at him, and did at the time. And then we turned around and came back. And so we continued the pseudo conversation where I'm kind of thinking about the possibilities of where that same pattern, the Trinity, fits in at that was a macrocosmic level, as far as I was concerned. So what's it show up as a microcosmic level? Because there has to be some consistency, and the fractal needs to repeat everywhere, right? Proton, electron, neutron.
Right.
So, and the space in between is the consciousness that manages it, right? Because we're 99% space, even rocks. That, right? At least this is what science is saying. So then we got back, and I got back in my body and came out of it. And in talking to the facilitator, he said, you know, what's interesting is that it took you 8 minutes to get there and 8 minutes to return. Of course, that got me thinking about, okay, what speed did we travel at?
Mm.
And it
Wow.
certainly wasn't the speed of light. It had to have been much faster. So I was curious, okay, what's the speed of thought potentially? And I've never seen anything other than a reference of it in the Urantia book. And so I happen to have a copy of it. I've had one for, I don't know, 30 years and or so. And I found the reference, and it says that the speed of thought is 841 trillion miles per second.
Goodness me.
So, you know, I don't have any of the references to go by. I'm just looking to try and fit all this stuff into some kind of structure that makes sense, that I can share and that I can demonstrate how to live in it, which is what I do with my partnering sessions for building road and bridge construction. Only it's, you know, I don't talk metaphysics to the very analytical world or the left brain thinkers. And then the transformational coaching, which is where I can help individuals really, you know, get in touch with that inner knowing that they already have and adjust their lives, whether it be business or personal, professional growth or anything like that.
Right, right.
Just an example, I took a chiropractor and we've been in business for 20 years. It took him 7 years to realize that, okay, yeah, it's time to talk to me. I'd met him previously, gave him a card. He'd been through 2 other business consultants, finally contacted me. He says, hey, Zen, I think I'm ready for you. I said, okay, let's go. And so in 90 days, we increased his monthly revenue by 35%. He went from 21,000 to 32,000 monthly revenue in the off season, simply because of the things that we created together and his ability to implement those.
Yep. Yep. So are we alone or preparing for a family reunion?
Well, I think the family reunion's already in process. One of the things that happened to me as well, and this has to do more with the Federation, the Ishtar Command, that kind of stuff. I was announced as the son of Ishtar in 2000 at a event in Camp Verde, and I was a little taken aback because they did it to me at the end of the event, and I was like, you know, but yet it resonated, so I didn't question it, you know. So shortly thereafter, that was in October of 2000, and in second week of February, started on a Tuesday, I found myself on board a ship and emceeing a series of meetings about the duties and responsibilities and protocols of first contact. And the audience was around 300, because it was called Council of 300. Eventually, I saw a channeling about it online through 3 or 4 weeks later. And it described exactly what was going on. So audience is all ETs, all kinds of different races. And I'm emceeing this thing and introducing others who are speaking to particular areas of the process. And, you know, the whole process that was laid out, Grant Cameron actually talks about it, but it was 15 years later.
Right, right.
Which is kind of cool, right? Because I'm still, it's like, man, I can't talk about this stuff. It just sounds too incredulous. And yet at the end of that, so that was 4 nights that went on. And at the end of it, they present me with this plaque that I guess for being the MC and being present there. And what was also interesting is that there were multiple perspectives from which I was able to view it, from my own eyes, from back behind me, and from the back of the audience. And so it was, you know, it's kind of weird. But it was in that luminary space or liminal space. So there's lots of other things that can happen with just having a point of consciousness you can bounce around and observe with. Like Don Juan's talking about the assemblage point. It's not just in the body, you can move it anywhere.
Yeah.
Remote viewing is another example of that. So at the end of it, they gave him this plaque, and the plaque's probably 3/4 of an inch thick, 14 by 17 roughly, two little square buttons just inside the lower corners of it, with a stylized Eye of Horus inside of those, and on one, and they looked like chairs at that point, like these really ornate chairs that had the Eyes of Horus as the cushion or the seat. And on top of one was a sign of Alpha, on top of the other was the sign of Omega. And in the center, about 2/3 of the way up, was this bi-directional rotating kind of feathered serpent medicine wheel, if you will. And it was translucent. So you could see through it, but you could also see these two objects spinning. And then I came out of it and went on, right? So that kind of, to answer your question, first contacts are ongoing. It's not a singular event.
Right.
It's an awareness gathering, building, community development from a much different level. You know, Costa Macrias is doing a lot of work with CE5 groups around the world.
Yep. Yep.
And so these are intentional groups that come together to reach out and figure out how to communicate.
Well, and on that would lead into the fourth question that was asked: will there indeed be a rise of consciousness that changes the way humans interact? I mean, that's happening now, isn't it?
Well, for a long time, I wasn't sure it was going to happen, right? It's like when I was told I was going to facilitate the New World or help facilitate. And facilitate means you just get people, places, and things to work together better, right? It's not about leadership, particularly, excuse me. So in this advancement, if you will, so when COVID hit, I got this, oh shit, here it is, feeling, right? So now we have the opportunity where the epitome of everything that's wrong is coming to the surface. And let me clarify that, because nothing's right or wrong. It's just how we perceive it. It's less than truth and the resonance that we are capable of having. And so in the whole advent of the fallacious narrative, it's the old command and control system trying to make a final move, and with the best of intentions. They think they're doing the right thing and trying to, you know, manage the population and be able to take care of it so that humanity survives. We need to consider that aspect of it. Now, I believe they're going about it all the wrong way,
Right.
And very surreptitiously, right? So that's not resonant with the natural emergence of our inner being. And so many of the conversations now that I'm having in virtual groups and with others and with my show, One World in the New World, is about, okay, let's talk about this inner development and how it's happening and what the evidence is of it, how the practical aspects are of it that can be applied in our personal lives, in our business lives, in our professional lives, and in our community. So in developing that sense of being, which actually you'll see the God participle right next to me, it's an atomic stroll in being, right? It's being is the God participle.
Yeah.
And I love the English language and how we can use that. In the development of the being, it's again a new process, right? It's an awareness that's been developing, and it had a huge increase between the harmonic convergence and the winter solstice of 2012. Well, so that's the 2012 is the apex. What do you do with it once you have garnered that awareness and that consciousness? Well, a natural thing to do, and this is all a natural process, by the way, even at a genetic level, cosmic level. This is cosmic truth being played out through humanity. So at that, once you have that information, that awareness and consciousness, what do you do with it? Well, the natural thing to do is implement it back into the existing systems, right? Systems aren't awry, it's just how they're being managed. So virtually none of the physical structures on Earth will change simply because we've already built them. We don't want to destroy them unless they're using resources that are inappropriate. However, it's not the systems, it's how we use them, and the leadership of the management that's engaging them currently is all profit over people and planet agendas.
Right.
Right? And so in this being state, then over the next 15 years, which is the end of the cycle moving from the Piscean to the Aquarian age, at the end of those 15 years, then we will have that ability to, will have had the results of the leadership and the natural order of its emergence taking place. Now, on a scale, one of the experiments I have, I've got the independent party domain name for Arizona. So on the independencearizona.com site, I have the ways of creating the party in Arizona, because it's not recognized yet. It's not registered with the state, but everything that's there to do so is very simple, including all the forms, all the signature forms, electorate forms, all those things that are necessary. It just needs people to populate. Well, you can't have, the main concern that I'd had with it was, well, you don't have a platform. Well, duh, we don't have the people. People make the platform. Now, on the website, I talk about making sense common, and I talk about education and alternative energy and consciousness and doing the right things right and all that kind of stuff. So it's all there. And it's been up there since 2012. So, and again, it's just an experiment waiting for people to populate it, because this is all self-initiating. This is not a come in here by hook or crook or by convincing or by force. You know, there's no push or pull to this being. Being won't have that. Being is about being. You're in that place, you're connected to everything, you're able to experience that cosmic truth for you individually first, and then watch as it rolls out in the environment that's around you.
All right, so we're kind of getting pretty close to time here, but I just wanted you to talk to us a little bit about one of the chapters in the book, Stubbing Your Toe. The ultimate encounter was the ultimate coming to Jesus moment for you.
Yeah, there's been multiple, but this one was witnessed by others, which makes it just so. Again, 1989. Just previously, I'd gone through a horrific divorce that was final on 11/22/88. I had 4 kids. Just heart-wrenching. It wasn't something that I wanted, and yet as part of the process. I won't go into the details. It freed me to find me again. Now, today, I have 9 grandkids and 5 great-grandkids.
Right.
So it worked. We're rather estranged. In the process, though, I moved into a house with another friend of mine that had attended my early UFO discussion groups, and he called me one day and said, "Hey, Zen, I'm looking for a." No, I actually wasn't going by Zen yet, but he says, "Hey, I'm looking for a roommate." And I said, "No, you're not," and because my ex and kids had moved back to Indiana at that point. And so, long story short, moved in, got involved with a group that he was involved with, the Association for the Understanding of Man, which was a Ray Stanford group that they based their stuff on his teachings. And the elder of the group was in his mid-60s at the time. I was in my early 30s. And they decided to have a spiritual retreat at Woods Canyon Lake, Northern Arizona. So a dozen of us went up there. We met at the lake, and there was a small rock, flat rock with a larger rock behind it that I sat on with my back to the lake. The rest of the group sat on a log that was a tree that had been fallen, and the facilitator sat on the stump. Excuse me. And he'd asked us to act as if Jesus was in our presence. Well, the rest of the group just had a real difficult time with that. And instead of just launching into it, they started asking him a bunch of questions, and they just couldn't do it. So I got frustrated after a while. I was impatient, right? And I spoke up. I said, "Hey, it's easy like this. Dude, glad to have you here. Let's party." And the facilitator thought that was a bit much, and he kind of, okay, I think we're done with that.
Mm-hmm.
And so he says, what I'd like you to do, I'm going to take on a guided meditation. So I want you to just close your eyes, take a couple of deep breaths, and we'll get started. So okay, I close my eyes, I take a deep breath, and this light pops on above me. And this eyes closed, and I look up internally, and guess who? And here's this, magnificent being above me, in white raiment. I mean, it was, the classic. And yet there was a ray of light that came from his forehead and his heart that connected about 18 inches, 2 feet above me, and bathed me with that same iridescent, effervescent, high-pitched sensation that I had in the white light.
Mm-hmm.
And he says to me, "I would like to speak through you." At that point, I became a blubbering baby. I just totally lost it. Cried so deeply. It was just because I didn't feel worthy. I was having the same experience that the folks were on the log earlier.
Right.
My mother, adopted mother, had told me not 2 months before, don't ever let anybody channel through you. So I had to let go of all that and step into that fearless place again. And so I took another deep breath and opened my mouth up. And the first words out of it, of course, "Know that I am with you always." The second sentence, though, was the one that got me. And he says, "This one's fear is great." I knew he was talking about me. And I had you remember the TV show? Yeah, I had "What's talking about, Willis" moment.
Yeah, different strokes.
And that allowed us to have a separate sidebar as he continued to speak through me to the group. And this was just really weird. Now, I don't know to this day what I said to the group. All I know is when I came back, their mouths were gaping. And so while I was in our sidebar, the first thing he says to me is, "Your fears are the same as mine were."
Mm-hmm.
And of course, mine are of not fulfilling that facilitation of the New World Order role that I was given. And then he shows me a bunch of videos and comparisons between his life and my life and things like that. And in no way do I want to even equate my life to his in perspective, right?
Mm-hmm.
And yet I do carry that energy, obviously. Humbling, tremendously humbling to be in this place. And yet the work still has to get done. So after we finished, or I guess as part of the contingency plan, right? I heard a branch break as somebody was walking up the path, and hearing that brought me out of that place, wherever it was. And so as I'm looking at the rest of the group and I'm seeing these mouths gaping, I could not talk. All I wanted to do was hum. That's all I could do for several hours afterwards.
Wow. Okay, so what did that all mean?
He gave me, kind of like the psychiatrist gave me, the corroboration that I needed to continue. Because my life, I'd spent 10 years in a marriage to climb the corporate ladder. I was a production control coordinator for an aerospace company in charge of $7 million in shipments a month. I finished my bachelor's degree. I was an elder in the church. And my wife ended up having affairs towards the end of the marriage, and told the bishop that I was having affairs. I didn't have time, let alone the desire. I was focused on building our life together. And so I was just so totally committed to being the best me that was possible. I was trying to live that life.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Didn't work. So all of that suddenly got ripped away. And here I was starting fresh. I'd lost my job, lost my friends, lost the church, lost my wife, lost my kids. I mean, talk about a country, country and western song,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
You lose everything.
yeah.
Um, and so I was just empty, right? And the only thing I could do was tune in and to me and ask questions to help rebuild my life in a way that was substantial and sustainable.
Hmm. Yep. No, I understand. I come from a similar place.
I
Zen,
think many do,
yeah.
quite frankly, especially in these times and going forward, the unimaginable destruction to people's lives that this pandemic or plandemic or whatever it is has had
Hmm.
is globally. So, part of what I'm hoping to do through these discussions and for in my One World in a New World and the work that I do is helping to find a way to create or at least acknowledge the process and plant seeds in the thoughtmosphere
Yep.
that can grow and evolve on their own and at least make some semblance of order and help to make that sense common so that we can all at least have some a minimal view of the perspectives that give us the solace and empowerment necessary and courage to continue to be in the place of love,
Hmm.
faith, love,
Yep.
and trust, and building our relationships on that foundation.
One more question before we wrap it up. What do you believe the experiencer numbers are around the world?
I would say they're probably in the millions.
Hmm.
The thing about being an experiencer is everybody else thinks you're nuts
Right,
for the most
right.
part if you start sharing. And so that minimizes the conversations from the get-go.
Yeah.
And it also is a great disservice to those experiencers because they're just looking to find order too.
Hmm.
Their lives have become chaos. Well, the thing
Yep.
about chaos is there is embedded order. It's not chaos. It's one of the things that Wilbert Smith, by the way, Wilbert was the director for Project Magnet, which was Canada's UFO investigation program in the 1950s, and it was funded by the Ministry of Transportation of all things.
Wow. Yeah.
Um, One of the other things that he says in the book is that, um, for one, time is a measurement of the change of entropy, and that there was a couple of points that came up, and specifically in relevance to um, the advancement of consciousness and our ability to merge those worlds. And that if we see, here's the point, if we see an anomaly, it simply means we don't understand enough yet.
Hmm. Okay. And your point about experiences, and I mean, I guess the majority don't talk about it because, as you say, they're trying to find order or make sense to it. But you cast your mind back to your school days. I mean, you seem to have come through it pretty well. But how many kids did you go to school with that seemed like outcasts and seemed a little strange, didn't quite fit in? How many of those kids do you think were going through experiences but just didn't want to talk about it?
A lot of them, I'm sure, were, because when you're kids, that you open up, and because I was going through stuff, I thought everybody else did too, and I even took that into my teenage and early adult life. Um, Found it not to be true, but
Right.
and yet, yeah, there's probably a lot of them. One of the things that um, I'm always looking for ways to assist and implement things that can be helpful. after I taught high school for a number of years, and I wrote a business plan for a model school that focused on holistic education, and that means the body, mind, spirit, and earth.
Mm-hmm.
Because the earth's conscious too. You know, we really are her children. We're made of stardust, and the stardust came from the planet. This is all the nutrients and things that we eat and build and all that kind of stuff. So in doing that, then we're in a new place, right? Where we can take advantage of who we are, what we know, and the development of assessing kids growing up first, what their attitudes, aptitudes, proclivities, you know, those kinds of things are, and nurture them. That's one of the things that my wife said, that Luba is her name. It actually means love in Russian.
Mm-hmm.
In her, excuse me, she's a conservatory trained pianist. So they picked her at 5 years old and put her through the Russian educational system. We don't have that. We don't acknowledge the gifts and talents that the kids have early on and try to develop them. We put them in a box. We teach them to, you know, to do a test, and then we monitor results and we scale them and we call, you know, categorize them, and we do nothing to service their creative side, their innovative side, their ability to actually be who they are, right? That we're talking about this perfected form, fit, and function in the world. Well, we don't give it a chance. We program it out of them.
Mm-hmm.
Because this in the Western world anyway, or in America, because of our educational systems. And so writing that business plan, I took it to the Child Protective Services Director of Education in Arizona. He said, I love it, Zen. You're like years ahead of us. I don't know if we'll ever catch up. That was in 2002.
Wow.
In earlier this year, actually, in May, I was invited to make that same presentation, altered it a little bit, but to make that same presentation to a Building Regenerative Communities virtual festival. It had about 700 attendees, and there was maybe 50 people in the room when I gave the presentation. So here I am, you know, 20 years later, I'm still not sure it's time, right? Because we're not seeing things from the perspective of truly nurturing. We talk about it. It's in the educational, you know, programs and the edicts of what education is supposed to do, and yet we don't follow through with the, for lack of a better, truth of how that actually needs to be implemented.
Okay. Zen, give us a website we can go to where people can learn more about your work.
Well, the digital vitae is my name, zenbenefiel.com.
Okay.
There's a row of buttons across the top that are a series of rabbit holes of which you'll enjoy the burrows.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I mentioned stubbing my toe earlier, the book behind you. Where can people download and read that?
Well, I think I just sent you a PDF copy for it. It's on Amazon.
Oh, okay.
It is a Kindle Unlimited. So if you have an Amazon account, you can download it for free. I think it's like, I don't know, $5 otherwise, maybe $7. I'm not sure. And there are paperback and hard copy versions, I believe.
Mm-hmm. No, it's a great read. Great read. I highly recommend it.
Thank you. It actually got me, if I could just add one more thing.
Yep.
So here's an example of what happens when you set your intention and let go. In 1990, I started One World. There were two people I wanted to emulate, Bill Moyers and Dr. Jeffrey Mishlove. And I hoped someday I would be worthy of an interview with one of them. Okay, that was in 1990. 2018, in June, I get a voicemail from my Ufology Press website, only one that had been up for 6 or 7 years. It's the only voicemail I've ever received, and it was Jeffrey.
Wow.
He was reaching out to me to say, hey, I just did an interview with Jason Giorgiani on the Greys, and I think your audience would enjoy it. Would you please take a look and promote it if you would? And so, you know, I was thinking, okay, here's, you know, serendipitous moment, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I watched the interview, wrote a blog post, posted it, sent that link to him along with a PDF copy of Stubbing My Toe on Purpose. And I got a message back from him 3 days later. Hey, would you like to come talk about it?
Wow. Fantastic.
So in August of that year, 2018, We went up, did 2 interviews on Saturday and 1 on Sunday, and they were titled A New World Order, which is the first one. And these are titles he chose, right, after reading the book. New World Order, The Sociology of Ufology, and On Hearing Voices. Great stuff, you know, and I tell you, you know, from a heart space, from my whole being, it was like a massive credibility boost.
Yep.
As well as
I understand
just
that.
the fact that that dream come true happened.
Yep. Fantastic. Zen, I want to talk to you again at some stage in the future. Maybe we can collaborate on something. I don't know, but I think our paths have crossed, and I think we can probably work on something together maybe in the future.
I would love to, Dean. You know,
fantastic.
It's all about working with people, places, and things to get stuff done. And
exactly
the more
right.
we can do that, the better we get.
Yep. Fantastic. Zen, thanks for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Dean. Namaste and in la catch.
Thank you. Zen Benefiel speaking with us today.